Nancy Pelosi publicly humiliated to her face.
Mr. Reagan.
So should Hillary in 2016, and so too should Congresswoman Pelosi, instead of saying the 2016 election was, quote, hijacked.
Was what?
Quote, hijacked.
It was.
Thank you.
This was too good. This gentleman is called Winston Marshall. He is the former guitarist and banjo player for Mumford & Sons, a super popular band that I have to admit, I don't think I have ever listened to, but perhaps I should, because this guy is awesome. And this exchange is made all the more rich by Pelosi's reaction, a reaction that was exposed by Marshall himself. Now we're going to break all this down and reveal what Nancy Pelosi's reaction was to this in one moment. First, of course, I have to tell you something. You guys know as well as anyone that gold equals stability. With the unpredictable stock market and economic turmoil, gold shines as a safe haven. Bishop Gold Group is America's trusted precious metals dealer, and they offer refuge from financial uncertainty. Protect your retirement from the looming threats of taxes and penalties by investing in gold. Don't wait for the next market crash. Now is the time to safeguard your wealth by converting stocks and retirement funds into gold. Unlike volatile digital assets, holding physical gold puts security directly into your hands. Trust Bishop Gold Group to guide you through securing your retirement with the stability of precious metals. And Bishop is offering up to $10,000 in free silver with a qualified purchase. So call 833-703-4138 or go to bishopgoldgroup.com/Reagan or click the link in the description below to start investing in gold today. Nancy Pelosi is, I believe, the single most corrupt and evil figure in American politics today. A couple years back, I produced an entire video on this woman's corrupt family and her own history of remorseless corruption, enriching herself at the expense of the American people. Nancy Pelosi was born Nancy D'Alessandro. Her father, Thomas D'Alessandro, or Big Tommy, as he was known, was a U.S. congressman from Maryland, and eventually he became the mayor of Baltimore. According to FBI records, Big Tommy D'Alessandro was, quote, a constant companion of John Cataneo, Benjamin Magliano, and redacted, obviously some other criminal. Okay, so Pelosi's father had mafia connections. Does that mean that he was involved in criminal activity himself? Oh yes, he absolutely was. The FBI was informed by Cataneo, the owner of the ship cleaning company, that he'd contributed large sums of money toward the Democratic mayoral campaign of Big Tommy D'Alessandro. And they were told that in exchange, Cataneo was promised lucrative sanitation contracts for the city of Baltimore. As far as I can tell, the FBI never investigated this, which actually makes a lot of sense. You see, Big Tommy D'Alessandro was good friends with an important man who worked in the FBI at the time. You may have heard of him. His name, J. Edgar Hoover. Because of Hoover's interference, the FBI never properly investigated Nancy Pelosi's father, Thomas Big Tommy D'Alessandro. According to Wikipedia, quote, D'Alessandro was a strong contender for governor of Maryland in 1954, but was forced to drop out due to being implicated in receiving undeclared money from Dominic Paracci, a parking garage owner convicted of fraud, conspiracy, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Paracci made several payments to Big Tommy D'Alessandro, totaling $11,000, about $200,000 today. These were kickbacks. Basically, Paracci bribed Mayor Big Tommy for lucrative city development contracts, and Big Tommy took those bribes. Despite Paracci's conviction, though, somehow Nancy Pelosi's father never saw the inside of a jail cell. In fact, he never went to court. He was never even arrested. The powerful mayor got away with the scheme scot-free. And this is Nancy Pelosi's family history. This is how she was raised. Her father was a criminal, and his friends were criminals. I wonder how many wise guys were hanging around the house when Nancy was sitting down to her piano lesson or ordering the maids about. Anyway, this all gives us some insight into her tactics as Speaker of the House, and we can see the effect of her upbringing in her own activities. Pelosi has been engaged in all sorts of shady deals while she's been in Congress. Much of this is outlined in this book, Peter Schweitzer's 2011 masterpiece, Throw Them All Out. If you don't have this book and you want to know about some of the corruption in Washington, D.C., get a copy.
The access to initial public stock offerings, the opportunity to buy a new stock at insider prices just as it goes on the market. They can be incredibly lucrative and hard to get.
And former House Speaker Nancy Pelosi and her husband had participated in at least 8 IPOs. One of those came in 2008 from Visa, just as a troublesome piece of legislation that would have hurt credit card companies began making its way through the House. Undisturbed by a potential conflict of interest, the Pelosis purchased 5,000 shares of Visa at the initial price of $44. 2 days later, it was trading at $64. The credit card legislation never made it to the floor of the House.
I will hold my record in terms of fighting the credit card companies as a Speaker of the House or as a member of Congress up against anyone's.
Now, I would like to break down a lot of the points that have been made in this debate. There were a number of debaters, but I'm just going to focus on Nancy Pelosi and this gentleman, Winston Marshall.
Well, let's define what is happening with populism today. Populism is put forth with an ethno-nationalist populism and generated by an ethnic negativity about immigrants, people who are different from them, these people, and the rest.
Pelosi starts out her speech with demagoguery. Her entire position rests on a lie. Populism, she claims, is ethno-nationalism. This is, as I'm sure you're aware, what we call a straw man. She's arguing from the inferior position. It is logically inferior. It is factually inferior. It is even emotionally inferior insofar as her position cannot evoke an emotional response that would overwhelm the rationality of the opposing position. So Pelosi falls on one of the left's standard debate tactics. She creates a new position for her opposition, a straw man, and then she debates against that. Instead of debating against the rational argument for populism, she debates against the apparently irrational argument for ethno-nationalism. Now, no one in this debate has argued for ethno-nationalism. But as Pelosi is not intelligent enough to argue in good faith here, she simply flips the debate to one in which she has an easy advantage. This is very much in the habit of her corrupt father, her corrupt son, and her corrupt self, because she is totally corrupt.
What is democracy? Let's define democracy. Democracy is the rule of law. Democracy is free and fair elections. Democracy is about the independent judiciary. It's about freedom of the press, to have transparency and to have accountability of elected officials to the people. And that is everything that the populist regime in Washington, D.C. is against. Populism is about ethno-nationalistic populism, as is the threat to democracy, is about threatening what they call elites. A free press. No thanks. Free press. It's about fighting issues that relate to free and fair elections, where we have voter suppression to the nth degree under this regime.
And now she just starts name-calling. Pelosi's supporting evidence for her ethno-nationalism claim is just fabricating motivations for the populist position. She says that populism is against the rule of law, free and fair elections, an independent judiciary, freedom of the press, and accountability of elected officials. She claims that populists are against all of these things. She claims that populists are all about voter suppression. Of course, none of this is remotely true, but she claims it because these things sound bad, right? She's just making arbitrary claims with zero evidence. This is empty rhetoric. It's the debate tactic of the intellectually feeble. It is an infantile strategy. It essentially amounts to name-calling. She's basically just screaming, "You're racist."
Right now, we see trial by jury threatened by vicious assaults on the jurors.
And then she throws in, arbitrarily, this lie that populists threaten jurors in trials. I presume she's talking about Donald Trump specifically, which is a lie that leftists in America have perpetuated for ages. But I think that she is desperate to find some way to look good in this debate, so she's just throwing everything against the wall. But this is a completely disjointed set of points that amounts to a whole lot of nothing. All right, I'm not going to bore you with every second of video here. She then rambles on for a while with borderline incoherent lies about specific U.S. legislation, crap that's surely lost on 99.9% of the people listening to her. But then she stumbles her way to her next disingenuous point.
We've seen demagogues come down the pike, destroy the press. What do the Republicans say? Fake news. So they're diminishing that in the eyes of these poor souls who are looking for some answers. We've given them to them, but they're blocked by some of their views on guns. They have the 3 Gs, guns, gays, God, that would be a woman's right to choose. And the cultural issues cloud some of their reception of an argument that really is in their interest.
Pelosi's basically trying to propose that populists are demagogues, ironically, who want to create fear and lie to the public about the mainstream media. And she seems to maintain that the public is susceptible to this demagoguery because those who listen to demagogues have their judgment clouded by 3 issues: guns, gays, and God. And let's be clear here. She is talking about conservatives like me. And she pretends that she understands my psychology and that the entire spectrum of my political philosophy is limited by my perception of guns, of gays, and of God. And she specifies that my perception of God clouds my ability to think rationally about the abortion issue. Well, we all know that this is not just wrong. This is offensively wrong. Anyone who watches my show will know that I have an opinion on just about every significant political issue of the day. And more importantly, the average fan of this show has a broad political understanding and opinions on all the significant political issues of the day. And conservatives generally tend to think a lot about political issues. She's not just wrong, she is offensively wrong. This is Hillary's basket of deplorables comment all over again.
You could put half of Trump supporters into what I call the basket of deplorables. The racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, Islamophobic, you name it.
This is Obama's claim that conservatives are bitter and clinging to guns and religion and antipathy to people who aren't like them.
It's not surprising then that they get bitter. They cling to guns or religion or antipathy towards people who aren't like them.
I mean, no wonder these guys have to cheat to win elections. They certainly have no ability to present any kind of charm offensive. And so it makes sense that, Nancy Pelosi, she's just going to characterize conservatives as dumb hicks, right? It makes sense that Barack Obama basically is doing the same thing. And Hillary Clinton, right? We're all a bunch of deplorables. These corrupt leftists never learn. 1, you are not as intelligent as you think you are. 2, you don't understand conservatives at all. During an interview with my buddy Sebastian Gorka, Winston Marshall characterized Nancy Pelosi's reaction to what he was saying, and his perception was that Nancy Pelosi has never heard any of these arguments before, and I think he's right.
You get a sense, I think I got a sense of this woman that hadn't heard these arguments before, and they couldn't even get inside her head without just triggering her.
Nancy Pelosi really is a nasty witch. I would use another word, but there might be children watching. Okay, 8:20 to 8:30.
Using ethno, whether it's people different from me, nationalism, populism, is a very dangerous threat to democracy, not just in America where we're seeing it play out, but in the whole world.
All right, so now she circles back to these people are racist lie. I mean, she really has no rational points here. It's just slander and name calling. This is so weak. It's so weak, it's actually kind of sad. It would at least be interesting if she presented a robust debate, but name calling? I mean, I am glad she was humiliated, of course, but this is just disappointing. I'm not mad, Pelosi. I'm just disappointed.
The fact that's so sad is a misrepresentation of people who exploit the populist attitude of, I want to have my say, and then use it to get elected and then hurt those people the most. hurt those people the most with it, as I say, unfair taxation, unfair distribution of resources. A budget should be a statement of our national values. Instead, it's a vehicle to put more money in the pockets of his contributors. And on top of all of that, taking away health care and the rest by lying about it all.
Okay, so here Pelosi once again expresses herself in the least comprehensible way possible. She's about like one click down from the fumbling nature of a Joe Biden speech. But what she's talking about here is Trump, right? She's trying to suggest that Trump is a con man. She's trying to suggest that Trump uses the illusion that the Trump supporters' voice is heard when Trump speaks as their champion. But then, after Trump is in office, he exploits his own voters and essentially steals their taxes in order to line the pockets of his campaign contributors. Now, if you watch my show, you will know that this is exactly what Nancy Pelosi does. This is exactly what Democrats do. Donald Trump is probably the only politician in the country who we know for a fact does not do this. In fact, the primary reason why many of us desperately want Trump to be president again is to cut out the corruption that has so deeply infected Washington, D.C. We say drain the swamp, but what we really mean is cut out the cancer of corruption. But of course, Nancy Pelosi flips it because that's what leftists do. You always know what nasty, corrupt thing a Democrat politician is up to by what they accuse conservatives of doing.
So my friends, this is interesting academically, intellectually, and the rest. But on the ground, populism, as the version that we see now, is a threat to democracy that's really hard to deny.
So Nancy Pelosi closes with this idea that the debate is interesting academically, but on the ground, as she puts it, populism is a threat to democracy. Her justification for this idea is that populism is, she claims, actually ethno-nationalism. So as I said, her entire argument rests on a lie. It rests on a straw man. She has essentially admitted that the populist argument wins, but she tries to circumvent this embarrassing loss by redefining populism in a way that lets her win. She makes no arguments against populism as it actually is, but rather, she simply says in the most convoluted way possible, you're a racist. And that is the only argument Democrats have for anything. All right, now let's look at Winston Marshall's brilliant response.
Let me address some common fallacies, some of which have been made tonight. If the motion was that demagoguery was a threat to democracy, I would be on that side of the House. If the motion was that political violence was a threat to democracy, I'd be on that side of the House.
So Marshall starts out by striking back against the straw man, which I love. The point he's making is that the word populism is being defined by Pelosi in all kinds of negative ways. Of course, most people would be against populism if the definition was simply racism or political violence or demagoguery or xenophobia or suppression of voting rights or whatever other pejorative term that Nancy Pelosi has attached to it. But that's not what populism is. Basically, Marshall is calling out the straw man and establishing the definition of populism appropriately. And in that moment, he has already destroyed Nancy Pelosi's entire proposition.
January 6th has been mentioned. A dark day for America, indeed.
All right, now I certainly do not like that he says that January 6th was a dark day. I mean, it was a dark day, but we need to clarify that it was a dark day because it was a false flag psyop. But let's just move past this.
January 6th has been mentioned. A dark day for America, indeed. And I'm sure Congresswoman Pelosi will agree that the entire month of June 2020, when the federal courthouse in Portland, Oregon was under siege and under insurrection by radical progressives, those too were dark days for America.
There is no equivalence there. So that, yes.
So you don't agree? That's fine, you don't agree, that's fine.
But it is not like what happened on January 6th, which was an insurrection incited by the President of the United States.
Pelosi has to interrupt because she has to dispute the point that left-wing political violence and right-wing political violence are both bad, because she needs to maintain the lie that January 6th was a terrible insurrection. It's a petulant moment, but it's great because it just shows how childish and pathetic that woman is. She has to interrupt to repeat the lie that January 6th was an insurrection incited by Donald Trump. Never mind that it was a psyop that you directed. Honestly, I don't think Marshall should have allowed her to interrupt, but by doing so, she did humiliate herself. So it kind of worked out well in the end.
My point, though, is that all political movements are susceptible to violence and indeed insurrection. And if we were arguing that fascism was a threat to democracy, I'd be on that side of the House. Indeed, the current populist age is a movement against fascism. Populism, as you know, is the politics of the ordinary people against an elite. Populism is not a threat to democracy. Populism is democracy. And why else have universal suffrage if not to keep elites in check? Given the success of Trump, and more recently Javier Milei taking a chainsaw to the state behemoth of Argentina's bureaucratic monster, you'd be mistaken for thinking this was a right-wing populist age. But that would be ignoring Occupy Wall Street. That would be ignoring Jeremy Corbyn's for the many, not the few. That would be ignoring Bernie against the billionaires, RFK Jr. against Big Pharma, and more recently, George Galloway against his better judgment. Now, all of them, including Galloway, recognize genuine concerns of ordinary people being otherwise ignored by the establishment. I'm actually rather surprised that our esteemed opposition, Congressman Pelosi, is on that side of the motion. I thought the left was supposed to be anti-elite. I thought the left was supposed to be anti-establishment. Today, particularly in America, the globalist left have become the establishment.
This is the point. The truth is that populism is a kind of nebulous term. Different people define it in different ways. So the debate is a little bit silly because those in favor of populism will define it as democracy. The people choose. The popular ideas are the ones that win out. Now, those who are against populism, right, they're going to demonize it in any way they see fit. So Pelosi characterizes it as a movement motivated by bigotry and hatred, and, it's something to be curtailed. Well, depending on the characterization, both could be right. If populism is simply a movement in favor of policies that are in the people's best interest, well, then it's good. If it's a movement motivated by hatred and bigotry, well, it's bad. But Winston Marshall gets to the core of the current Trump-era populism. It is a movement motivated by checking the power of the so-called elites, not out of spite, resentment, or envy, but because the elites currently are corrupt. And Pelosi, perhaps the most corrupt of them all, is sitting right there. And that's why this speech is so delicious. Many men might have delivered the same speech in 1,000 different forms. Given the opportunity, I might well have delivered a similar speech myself. But this man was given the opportunity to deliver that speech to Pelosi's face. What a glorious opportunity. And he did not disappoint. A more eloquent takedown of a repugnant, corrupt, evil politician right to their face, I don't think I have ever seen. Maybe Trump.
It's just awfully good that someone with the temperament of Donald Trump is not in charge of the law in our country.
Yeah, because you'd be in jail.
Secretary Clinton.
But you have to give it to this guy, Winston Marshall. I feel like I was watching the return of the Founding Fathers whilst watching his speech. And it only gets better. Okay, 647 to 756.
The farmer revolts from Netherlands to Germany, France, Greece to Sri Lanka. Farmers are taking their tractors to the road to protest ESG policy that's floated down to us from those all-knowing, infallible elites of Davos. The trucker movement in Canada became anti-elitist when petty tyrant Prime Minister Justin Trudeau froze their bank accounts, not the behavior of a democratic head of state. The Gilets jaunes in France, ULEZ in London, working people protesting policy that hurt them. And how are they treated? They're called conspiracy theorists. They're called far right, by the mayor as well. Ladies and gentlemen, populism is the voice of the voiceless. The real threat to democracy is from the elites.
This is a critical point, and I love that he makes this point. Obviously, we discuss this ad nauseum on the show, and other conservative shows like mine do the same. It is not the right that is authoritarian, as Pelosi and the mainstream media would have us believe. No, it is the left, and we see it constantly. Trump will be a dictator, they said. Well, no, Trump was not a dictator. But you know who is? Joe Biden. He has unilaterally thrown open the border to illegal aliens, flying them in using taxpayer money.
And one of the problems of Joe Biden's open border policy is the Chinese illegals who are coming over the border. These numbers are astounding. 30,000 Chinese nationals since just October. We've had experts on national security and on China in particular. I've asked them directly, do you think the Chinese are standing up an army in our country? And the answer was clearly yes. The Chinese have a different system going on. They're staying at nicer hotels. They're not camping out on the water like all the other migrants. Something is happening, and our government is not on the up and up, as you said, about it.
And they're coming with the blessing of their country. And the question is why? What are their motives?
And of course, we all know he's putting his political enemy, Donald Trump, through a series of sham trials to take him off the campaign trail and perhaps even to imprison him. He's arrested countless innocent protesters who merely wanted to make their voices heard on January 6th, and so on and so forth. I could list countless abuses of his power, but these are just a couple of the bigger ones. And here, Winston Marshall lists the abuses of the left internationally, because the Biden administration is not unique in their corruption. Corruption is a fundamental characteristic of the left. Because let's be clear about our terms here. When we're talking about populism in the current era, we're talking about conservatism. And we're talking about the corrupt elites. We're talking primarily about rich and powerful leftists.
What about big tech? Throughout the pandemic, Biden's team, the FBI, and the Department of Homeland Security colluded with big tech in censoring dissenting voices, not kooky conspiracy theorists. People spreading true information, not misinformation, true information at odds with the government narrative. Need I remind you, democracy without free speech is not democracy.
I love this, primarily because this affects me specifically and every other conservative on social media whose channel gets suffocated because we challenge the views of Facebook or YouTube or Twitter or whatever. Thankfully, Elon Musk is trying to fix that, although my Twitter hasn't really grown all that much since Elon Musk has taken over, but maybe that's just because I'm crap at tweeting. And look, Marshall is 100% right. Democracy does not work without free speech. In fact, there are really just two fundamental rights that make up a free society: freedom of religion and freedom of speech. Everything else is negotiable. And some people are probably shouting at me right now that the right to bear arms is a fundamental right that makes up a free society. But I would argue that this is a fundamental right to maintaining a free society, which is slightly different.
Before COVID, intelligence services colluded with big tech to have Trump suspended off Twitter. Yes, the same platform which hosted the Taliban and Ayatollah deaf to Israel Khomeini, they thought the president crossed the line when he tweeted on Jan 6th, quote, "Remain peaceful, no violence, respect the law and our great men and women in blue." That's a quote. You may be thinking now that Trump is a populist. You are right. He didn't accept the 2020 elections, and he should have.
Now, I know he's trying to be balanced and fair here, but obviously I disagree. He's ignoring the reality that 2020 was not the most honest election in history, as leftists like to pretend. But okay, he's trying to sound reasonable. I understand the strategy.
So should Hillary in 2016, and so too should Congresswoman Pelosi, instead of saying the 2016 election was, quote, hijacked.
Was what?
Quote, hijacked.
It was.
you.
I love this moment. Marshall is absolutely thrilled that Pelosi has just proven his point for him. She's such an idiot that she actually proves the point of her opponent. And check out this freeze frame. I don't know if anybody else has noticed this, but even Pelosi's husband is laughing at her. It's fantastic.
What about the mainstream media? Let me read you some mainstream media headlines. The New Yorker, the day before the 2016 election. The case against democracy. The Washington Post, the day after the election. The problem with our government is democracy. The LA Times, June 2017. The British election is a reminder of the perils of too much democracy. Vox, June 2017. The two eminent political scientists say the problem with democracy is voters. New York Times, June 2017. The problem with participatory democracy is the participants. Mainstream media elites are part of a class who don't just disdain populism, they disdain the people.
I believe at this point, the point that the leftist mainstream media, the enemy of our current Trump-era populism, is publishing articles against democracy, I think that is such a compelling point that I believe that this point alone wins the day. All the points together are a masterpiece, but this point alone is enough to win. And the thought to include it? Stroke of genius.
Ladies and gentlemen, populism is not a threat to democracy, but I'll tell you what is. It's elites ordering social media to censor political opponents. It's police shutting down dissenters, be it anti-monarchists in this country or gender-critical voices here, or last week in Brussels, the National Conservative Movement. I'll tell you what is a threat to democracy. It's Brussels, DC, Westminster, the mainstream media, big tech, big pharma, corporate collusion, and the Davos cronies. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off ordinary people as deplorable. The threat to democracy comes from those who smear working people as racist. The threat to democracy comes from those who write off working people as populists.
Nancy Pelosi, having spearheaded the propaganda campaign against Trump, having torn up his State of the Union address in front of the cameras like a petulant child, she's right there, having her sins projected right in front of her. I love it. I don't think this speech could have been delivered better to Nancy Pelosi. She was fuming. This guy who she's never heard of, a man that is less than half her age, standing just inches away from her, publicly humiliated her. And there was nothing that she could do about it. Now, I mentioned at the top of the show that Pelosi's reaction to Marshall's eloquent takedown made the exchange even more epic. And I played a little clip about it earlier, but that wasn't what I was talking about. So what am I talking about? What was her response? Well, according to Marshall, quote, Congresswoman Pelosi was snidely mouthing, "Who are you?" at me throughout my speech. Another way of saying, do you know who I am?
She, at least twice, she goes, "Who are you? Who are you?" And of course, her to say, "Who are you?" what she's really saying is, "Do you know who I am?"
Now, to me, this is particularly detestable, and it perfectly illustrates Pelosi's contempt for the common man. Of course, Winston Marshall is not a common man to his fans, nor objectively. He is a legitimate rock star, and more importantly to me, he is a good man. But Pelosi has no sense of perspective. She probably didn't even Google the guy before going to Oxford. Pelosi herself is not an extraordinary person. She's simply willing to be more evil than your average American.
We call it the wrap-up smear. If you want to talk politics, you call it the wrap-up smear. You smear somebody with falsehoods and all the rest, and then you write it, and they'll say, see, it's reported in the press that this, and this. So they have that validation that the press reported the smear, and then you merchandise it. And then it's called the wrap-up smear. Now I'm going to merchandise the press's report on the smear that we made. And it's a tactic.
Whereas most people would be reluctant to sell out their country for their own personal gain, Pelosi jumps at such opportunities. Her father was a criminal, and so she's been taught from a young age the rules do not apply to her.
Madam Leader, I wanted to ask you why you and your husband, back in March of 2008, accepted and participated in a very large IPO deal from Visa. at a time there was major legislation affecting the credit card companies making its way through the House. And did you consider that to be a conflict of interest?
I don't know what your point is of your question. Is there some point that you want to make with that?
Well, I guess what I'm asking is, do you think it's all right for a speaker to accept a very preferential and favorable stock deal?
Well, we didn't.
You participated in the IPO.
Well, I have many
and at the time you were
investments,
Speaker of the House. You don't think it was a conflict of interest or had the appearance of a conflict of interest?
It only has the appearance if you decide that you're going to have elaborate on a false premise. But it's not true, and that's that.
I don't understand what part's not true.
Yes, sir. That I would act upon an investment.
This is the psychology of the narcissist. That armchair diagnosis is thrown around a lot these days, but in this case, I think it's true. The criminal is able to enrich themselves corruptly at the expense of others with no remorse because they don't see others as being at their level. They view themselves as inherently superior, and everyone else exists merely to serve them.
But we have to pass the bill so that you can find out what is in it away from the fog of the controversy.
Pelosi was never a particularly beautiful woman, nor a particularly charming person. She's not singularly intelligent or even really all that clever. The woman is merely willing to be evil. And with that willingness comes a huge advantage. If you are willing to do what others are not, to act in particularly vicious and sinister ways, others will fear you, and you will wield a great deal of power with that simple tool, evil. And so it is extremely dangerous for a sociopath to inherit power, as Pelosi has done. And I don't think it's a coincidence that Pelosi is constantly elected to office in the single most depraved region of the country, San Francisco. The LGBTQP community maintains that they are an oppressed minority in America. Of course, they're not. But by pretending that they are, they enjoy a number of great advantages. And Pelosi is a great champion of this particular special interest. She pretends to care about them and pushes forward any legislation they want, and in turn, she's elected over and over again. Both of these parties want power, and so they conspire to grant each other that power. Leave it to the sexually depraved to vote for the politically corrupt. And so it's no surprise that Pelosi would be humiliated in a debate against an opponent who, to her, is a completely unknown figure, a man who does not hold public office, who has not achieved any great success in politics or philosophy or industry. He was not initially in any way intimidating to someone with a soul that has been thoroughly blackened. But this man, Winston Marshall, he is a thinker. I don't know this man's entire political philosophy or his ideas on every issue, but what he said in this debate was spot on. What he expressed was simple, well-articulated common sense. And common sense is, of course, poison to left-wing artifice. Pelosi is used to getting away with lying. Her nonsense is seldom challenged, and when it has been in the past, she merely bullies those who have challenged her, often too polite to strike back.
You wrote, "The president only wants his name on a check to go out before Election Day and for the market to go up." Is that what this is all about? Not allow the president to take credit if there's a deal that will help millions of Americans?
That. With all due respect, and you know we've known each other a long time, you really don't know what you're talking about.
The reality is that Nancy Pelosi is a crook. Her father was a crook. Her son is a crook. And she is the biggest crook of them all. When the left-wing propaganda program 60 Minutes is reporting on the corruption of arguably the most powerful Democrat in D.C., the corruption has got to be pretty dang bad. The truth is that Pelosi should be in prison.
No one is above the law.
The lady doth protest too much. Well, that's it for me. Thank God for good men like Winston Marshall. Now go buy some of my overpriced crap on Teespring so I can keep trying to save the world. And remember, it's not that our liberal friends are ignorant. It's just they know so much. That is not so. Good night.